I never expected to open my front door and see her standing there with that greedy little smile, perfume so strong it walked in before she did, my ex-husband hiding behind her like a shadow that did not know where to look. And before I could even say hello, she lifted her chin and said, "We are here for our rightful share of your father's estate. This house, the company stocks. You need to pack your things and move out immediately." For a second, I just stared at her, hearing her words echo against the walls my father painted with his own hands. And all I could think about was how he used to say, "If that man ever leaves you, make sure he does not get a dime with my name on it." I repeated her words slowly, "My father's estate," as if I needed to taste how wrong they were in my mouth. And while she waved a stack of printed papers at me like a weapon, I felt something inside me go very still and very clear. I saw my ex shifting from foot to foot, unable to meet my eyes. And I remembered every night I waited up alone while he said he was working late, every tear I wiped away in the dark so no one would hear me, every time he told me I would be fine on my own. So I did not shout and I did not beg. I just stepped back from the doorway, opened it a little wider, and said, "Since you are both so sure about what you think you deserve, you might as well come in and let my lawyer explain what my father actually left behind. Thank you for staying with me and listening to my story. It means more than you know. And if you do not mind, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, so I can picture you there while I talk. My name is Dorothy, and I live in a small town in Maine, in the same house where I grew up. The same house my father worked his whole life to keep. And as I stood there in that doorway facing that woman with the greedy smile, I knew you could not really understand what this house means to me unless I told you a little about who I am. I am not a rich woman. I am a woman who has spent most of her life working, cooking, cleaning, and holding tired hands. I was a wife for many years. I am a mother. And before all of that, I was a daughter to a very stubborn man who believed that a home should be a shelter, not a prize for someone to grab when they smell money. My father laid these floors himself. He painted these walls. He used to come home with sawdust in his hair and say, "Dorothy, one day when I am gone, this place will keep you safe when people are not kind." So when I hear someone at my door telling me to move out, they are not just talking about bricks and wood. They are talking about the only place where I have ever really felt that I belonged. And that is why I want you to stay with me now, so I can tell you how everything went wrong long before that knock on the door. When I was a young woman in this same town, I remember standing on this very front step for a very different reason. Not because someone was trying to take the house from me, but because I was saying goodbye to my father for the evening while a handsome man with a crooked smile waited out by an old car. That man became my husband. And back then I thought I had won the lottery of the heart. He made me laugh. He brought me flowers from the side of the road. He talked about building a future together. And I believed every word because I wanted to. My father watched him the way a storm watcher looks at a dark cloud, not saying much at first, just observing. In those days I worked long hours, came home to cook, cleaned this house from top to bottom, tried to be a good wife and a good daughter. And somewhere in between, I tried to keep the peace between the two men in my life. My husband who said the house was too small and too old, and my father who said a man who insults your home is really insulting you. One evening, after my husband had left in a rush saying he was tired of arguing and needed air, my father sat down at this kitchen table, tapped his fingers on the wood he had sanded himself, and said, "Dorothy, listen to me. If that man ever walks out on you, you make sure he does not get a dime with my name on it." At the time I thought he was being dramatic, maybe even unfair, because I still believed my marriage was stronger than his worry. I see now that he was not speaking out of bitterness. He was speaking from a lifetime of watching how greed can hide behind a charming smile. How some people are happy to enjoy what you have, as long as they do not have to help you carry it. And those words he gave me back then, they are the reason that on the day my husband's new wife stood on my porch talking about her rightful share, I was not as helpless as they expected me to be. As the years went by, those words from my father stopped sounding dramatic and started sounding like a weather forecast I should have paid closer attention to. Because little by little, my husband's smile changed, his voice changed, even the way he looked at this house changed. At first it was small comments, him standing in the living room saying, "This place is worth a lot now, Dorothy. We could sell it, move somewhere newer, somewhere that feels more like us." And when I reminded him that this was my father's home, and that my father wanted it to remain in the family, his mouth tightened, and he said, "Your father is not the one who has to live here every day. We are, you and me." I was working, cooking, taking care of my father as his steps slowed and his hands shook a little more, pouring his coffee. And in between all that, I was trying to keep up with a man who suddenly seemed restless in every room. He started staying out later, saying he had meetings, then saying he was too tired to talk when he finally came home smelling of cologne that was not mine. Whenever bills came or talk of repairs, he would say things like, "If my name was on the deed, I could do more, get better loans, really unlock the value of this place." And every time he said it, I felt my father's voice in the back of my mind, like a firm hand on my shoulder, telling me to stay still. I told my husband that the house was already spoken for, that it was my inheritance and my safety, that whatever we built together we could share. But this one thing was anchored by a promise made long before he came into my life. And instead of accepting that, he started to act like I was hoarding something, as if I was keeping him outside in the cold, while I sat warm inside. The laughter we used to share at this kitchen table grew quieter, replaced by long silences and sighs. He picked fights over little things, the way I folded towels, the way I spent grocery money. But underneath every argument, I could hear the same question, beating like a drum. Why is this house not mine too? And every time I refused to bend, I could see his respect for me bend instead, not in my favor, but away from me. And that was when I first understood that the man I had married did not love the same things I loved. He loved the idea of owning them. The night everything finally cracked was not dramatic on the outside. There were no slammed doors or shattered plates. Just me standing in this kitchen with his phone in my hand, looking at messages that were not meant for my eyes. Messages where he called someone else beautiful, where he promised her trips and talked about how he was tired of living in an old house with an old life. And as I read his words, I felt something in me go very quiet, like a light being turned off room by room. When he walked in and saw me there, he did not even bother to lie for long. First he shouted that I had no right to touch his things, then he shrugged and said, maybe we had both changed, maybe it was time to move on. And he said it so calmly that for a moment I wondered if our whole life together had felt this small to him all along. In the weeks that followed, papers were drawn up, the kind of papers that turn love into lines and numbers, and I sat in an office with my hands folded in my lap while he divided what we had. He looked at me with those same tired eyes and said, "You will be fine, Dorothy. You always land on your feet." As if that was a gift he was giving me instead of a burden he was leaving behind. I went home to this house alone, walked through every room at night, and when I finally sat down at my father's old table, he reached across with his rough, aged hand, squeezed my fingers and said, "Now you listen to me. This is why I did not put his name on anything. This house, this estate, my company shares, they stay with you, no matter who walks in or out of your life." And those words became the only solid ground I felt I had left. After the divorce, the days blurred together. I went to work. I came home. I cooked simple meals for myself and for my father, and at night when the house was quiet, I could hear every regret echo against these walls. But my father did not let me sit in that sadness for long. One afternoon he called me into the living room, the sunlight falling across his thinning hair, and he said, "Dorothy, sit down. We are going to make sure no one ever uses your pain as an excuse to come after what I worked for." He had already spoken to his lawyer, a calm, careful man named Mr. Collins, who had known our family for years, and together they laid everything out on the table for me. The deed to the house that he had already signed into my name, the company papers that put his stocks into a trust for the future, with me as the one who would guard them, and then the will, where he had written in plain language that no spouse of my future would ever be entitled to one piece of his estate. I remember my hands shaking as I traced the edges of those documents, not because I was thinking of money, but because I felt the weight of his love in every decision he had made. He looked at me with those tired but steady eyes and said, "I cannot stop people from leaving you, Dorothy. But I can make sure they do not take the roof over your head when they go." And I did not know it then, but those signatures he put down that day would be the reason I was able to stand so calmly when greed came knocking years later. Time has a way of moving even when your heart wants it to stop. And after all those papers were signed and tucked away in Mr. Collins's office, life settled into a quieter rhythm. My father grew older in this house, his steps slower, his breath heavier on the stairs, and I learned every sound of his day. The way he coughed in the morning, the way his chair creaked when he sat down in the evening. Until one winter when I could see in his eyes that he was getting ready to leave this world. Even if he never said it out loud. I sat by his bed in the small room at the end of the hall, holding his hand while the snow tapped at the window, and he told me once more, almost in a whisper, that he was not worried about me, because the house was mine, the shares were locked for the family line, and that no signature from anyone else could undo what he had put in place. He squeezed my fingers and said, "Remember that when people start sniffing around, they will not be looking for you. They will be looking for what you have." When he passed 12 years ago, it felt like the whole building exhaled with me. Every nail and board suddenly a little heavier with his absence. And I walked through these rooms alone with my grief. But I also felt his decisions wrapped around me like a coat, keeping me warm when everything else felt cold. My ex-husband, on the other hand, did not stay alone for long. I started hearing through neighbors and small-town whispers that he was seeing someone new, then that he had married again. I would see them once in a while from a distance. Him walking a little taller beside a woman with bright clothes and sharp eyes, her gaze following the lines of this old house when they drove past. And even then, before she ever set foot on my front step, I could tell she did not see a home built on love and sacrifice. She saw a number, a prize, something to be claimed. And I remember thinking to myself, "Daddy, you were right to be careful, because the greed you warned me about is already walking around with fresh lipstick and high heels, just waiting for the right excuse to knock." The first time I actually stood close enough to hear her voice was not on my front step. It was in the aisle of the little grocery store in town. I was reaching for a carton of eggs when I heard my name said in that bright, too-sweet tone that makes your shoulders tense before your mind catches up. I turned, and there she was beside him. Her hand looped through his arm like she had known him all her life, her perfume spilling into the air between us. He could barely look at me, just mumbled a hello. But she stepped forward with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes and said, "So you must be Dorothy? I have heard so much about you." And before I could answer, she was already talking about how charming this old town was. How interesting it must be to live in a house with so much history. And did I ever find it too big to manage on my own? The way she said it made it sound like concern. But there was something sharp underneath, like a knife hidden in a bouquet of flowers. She asked little questions that did not feel little at all. Whether my father had left everything simple, whether I had help with the paperwork, whether the house and his company shares were all tied together. And every time she mentioned money, her eyes flicked to my face, waiting for a crack. I answered politely but carefully. I said my father had been very organized, that he had trusted a good lawyer, that everything was already settled, and I watched the way her smile tightened at the word settled. Like she had been planning a puzzle, and someone had just taken away a piece she needed. When they walked away, I stood there with my grocery basket hanging from my hand, my heart beating a little faster, and I thought, this woman is not just making conversation. She is mapping out my life in her mind, looking for a door she can push open. And I knew then that sooner or later she would stop circling and come straight to the source of what she wanted. It did not take long after that chance meeting in the store for the shape of her interest to become clearer. At first, it was little things. A message passed through someone we both knew, saying they hoped I was managing with all the legal matters. Then a call from my ex where he tried to sound casual as he asked if everything with my father's estate had been settled yet. If I needed advice, if I had thought about how fair it would be to divide things now that his life had changed. And every time he spoke that word fair, I could feel something tighten in my chest because it was not fairness he was thinking about. It was access. Then one afternoon she called herself, her voice sugary and sharp at the same time, saying she had been reading about how family assets should really be shared, how a house like mine could be put to better use for everyone, and how my father surely would not have wanted anyone to feel left out. She kept saying we all are family now, as if repeating it would make it true. But under every sentence I could hear the question she was really asking. How do I get my hands on what your father left you? When I hung up, I sat at this same kitchen table and felt a wave of anger and fear roll through me. But then I remembered my father's hand on mine and his words about being ready when people started sniffing around. So the next morning I took my worn folder of documents and went to see Mr. Collins. He greeted me kindly, poured me a glass of water, and spread everything out in front of us. The deed in my name alone. The trust papers for the company shares locked for the next generation. The will with its clear clause cutting off any claim from anyone who had married me. And for the first time since those calls started, I felt my shoulders drop a little. He looked me in the eye and said, "Dorothy, they can knock, they can talk, they can print whatever they want from the internet. But they have no legal ground under their feet. If they bother you again, you send them to me." I walked home through the cool air of Maine with that sentence in my pocket like a small stone of strength. And even though a part of me knew they would not give up easily, another part of me was no longer afraid, because I was not standing on memories alone. I was standing on my father's careful planning and a lawyer who knew every inch of it. So the day all of that planning was finally tested, the house was quiet. I was at the kitchen table with Mr. Collins going over a few last details, making sure my own will matched what my father had set up, when the doorbell rang and I felt, more than heard, that this was the moment we'd been getting ready for. I opened the door. You know how she stood there with that smug little smile and that strong perfume. You have seen her in your mind by now. And after she finished her speech about her rightful share, I stepped aside and let them walk into my living room. The very room where my father used to fall asleep in his chair after long days at work. She marched in like an inspector, her heels clicking on the floor, my ex trailing behind her looking like he wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. And then she saw him. Mr. Collins rising from his chair with that calm, polite expression he wears when he knows exactly what he is about to do. I watched the way her eyes flicked from his briefcase to my face, as if she was trying to measure how serious this was. She thrust her thick stack of printed pages toward him, talking fast about online advice and how the law was on her side, how the house and the company shares were part of some big family pot. And he listened without interrupting, took the papers gently from her hand, glanced through them, and then set them down like they were nothing more than grocery lists. He opened his own folder, pulled out documents with real seals and signatures. And in that steady voice of his he explained that my father's will named only me, that the deed to this house had been in my name for years, that the company stock was already locked in a trust for the next generation, and that there was a specific clause written in very plain language excluding any spouse of mine from ever touching my father's estate. As he spoke, I watched the color drain from her face. I saw my ex finally look up at me with something like shame in his eyes. And in that moment, I did not feel cruel or triumphant. I just felt my father standing beside me in every line on those pages. And I knew that no matter how loudly greed knocked, it had just met a wall it could not climb. When he finished speaking, there was a heavy silence in the room, the kind that makes every tick of the clock sound loud. She stared at the papers on the table like they were written in another language, then snapped her head toward me and said I was being selfish, that real family shares everything, that I was punishing them for moving on. And for a moment I just looked at her. This woman who had never spent one night in this house taking care of my father. Never carried him down the hall when his legs shook. Never sat up going through bills when the company hit hard times. I saw my ex step forward a little, his voice softer than hers as he said, "Dorothy, you could at least give us something. We are trying to start over." As if my safety and my father's work were a little pile of spare change he could ask for out of habit. I took a breath, felt all the years of sacrifice and disappointment and quiet strength rise up in my chest, and I said, "I did give you something. I gave you your freedom. When you walked out of this marriage, you took your clothes, your car, and your new life. But you do not get to take my father's name or his legacy on your way out the door. This house, this estate, they were never yours to lose, and they are not yours to demand now." She opened her mouth again, but Mr. Collins was already closing his folder, telling them calmly that unless they had real legal questions, there was nothing more to discuss, and that any further attempts to harass or threaten me about this property would be documented. I walked them to the door, not because I owed them that courtesy, but because I wanted to see this moment all the way through. She brushed past me without another word, her perfume sharp and bitter in the air. He hesitated on the threshold, looked back at me with eyes that finally seemed to understand what he had thrown away, and all I said was, "Take care of yourself," before gently closing the door. When the latch clicked, it felt like something stronger than wood settling into place inside me. I leaned my back against it, let out a long breath I felt like I had been holding for years, and for the first time since my father died, I was not afraid that someone would walk in and try to claim what he had left to keep me safe. After they left, and the sound of their car faded down the street, the house felt strange for a moment, as if it was listening with me. Then, a kind of soft stillness settled over everything. I walked back into the living room, looked at the papers still lying on the table, and instead of seeing legal words and signatures, I saw my father's tired hands signing them, his trust in me, his quiet way of loving without long speeches. I sat down in his old chair and let myself cry, not from fear this time, but from relief, from the weight of knowing that I had finally stood between his memory and the greed he had warned me about, and I had not moved. When the tears passed, I wiped my face, made a cup of tea, and told Mr. Collins that I wanted to finish what we had started before the doorbell rang. I wanted my own will to carry the same message my father's had carried, that what he built would pass to the next generation of our family, or to someone who truly needed a safe place, not to anyone who saw this house as a quick profit or a trophy. We went through every line slowly and carefully, and with each decision I felt more like I was stitching up a wound that had been left open too long. In the days that followed, I did small things that might seem ordinary to someone else, but felt important to me. I washed the curtains, I opened the windows to let in fresh air, I fixed a loose board on the front step, and I talked out loud to my father while I worked, telling him what had happened, telling him he had been right to be cautious, telling him that no matter who tried to lay claim to his life's work, his words and his planning had held firm. At night, I would sit at the kitchen table with a simple meal, listen to the familiar creaks of the house, and instead of hearing threats in every sound, I heard memories, the clink of his spoon in his coffee cup, the echo of his laugh, the way he used to say that a home is not just where you sleep, it is where you should feel protected. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that protection curling around me again. I knew the world outside my front door could still be unkind, that there would always be people who believed they could take whatever they wanted if they just pushed hard enough. But inside these walls, I finally understood that I was not just an old woman sitting on someone else's fortune. I was the guardian of my father's promise, and I had lived long enough to see that promise tested and stand, and that knowledge gave me a kind of peace no one could put a price on. When I think back on that day now, I do not just see a greedy smile at my door or a stack of useless papers waved in my face. I see the long road that led me there. Every sacrifice, every lonely night, every quiet act of love that my father and I poured into this house. And I realized that the real battle was never about bricks or money. It was about whether I believed I was worth protecting. For a long time, I let people treat my kindness like weakness. I let them talk over me, decide for me, walk in and out of my life as if I were just part of the furniture they were free to rearrange. But standing there in my own living room with my lawyer at my side and my father's words in my heart, I finally understood that saying no is not cruelty when you are defending the only safe place you have left. It is an act of self-respect. I want you to hear that. Wherever you are, if someone is trying to make you feel guilty for holding on to what you earned, for keeping the little bit of peace you have built with your own hands, remember that they did not live your hard days. They did not wipe your tears in the dark. They did not stand in the cold and still choose to open the door for others, and they do not get to decide what you owe them now. You are allowed to protect what is yours without apologizing for it. If you have ever had someone try to push you out of your own life, out of your own home, out of the things you worked for, I want you to tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place, or what you did do when it was your turn to stand your ground. Because I know many of you have your own stories tucked away behind quiet smiles. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this story. Thank you for keeping me company while I remembered my father and the promises he kept. And if my words made you feel a little less alone today, please subscribe so you can sit with me again next time, and we can share a few more truths together.